Firstly, I'd like to thank you all for coming today, and we've got a great panel here, so I'd like to welcome the speakers as well. I'll introduce them briefly as we go on, but just for now, as I'm sure you know, we've got Uzma Aslam Khan, Bina Shah, and on my right here, we've got Shandana, Minhas, and HM Naqvi. Just to start off with, this is a session on the Pakistani novel in English, another session. I know we have quite a few of them, and I'm hoping today that we can maybe move on with our thinking to think about Pakistani literature in English and how it's received at home as well as abroad. My focus of my research and writing work has looked at the international dimensions of Pakistani writing in English, particularly in the wake of the war on terror. But I chose the subtitle today, International Representation, Local Reception, because in discussing Pakistani fiction in English with readers in Pakistan, and for me that means particularly academics, students, other writers, other audiences at the KLF in previous years, I've been conscious that although home audiences may be proud of the fact that Pakistani novelists are acclaimed abroad, some readers also have strong opinions about who English language novels from Pakistan are not, or should be aimed at, and how they misrepresent or represent the country and its population abroad. In other words, although readers appear to be happy that Pakistani writing in English has an international profile, they also seem at times frustrated and, to use a word that the journalist Sara Sabri used in a piece she wrote about Pakistani literature in English, disoriented at times by the way they feel that Pakistani literature in English depicts their realities, whatever those are, overseas. So each of our speakers, I'm sure, I hope, will have their own opinions on this slightly contentious topic. And I hope that we can have a good debate around that and explore the question. Particularly, I'm interested in what they feel is the relative appeal of novels written in English which are specifically aimed at a local audience and describe a local context. And I think there are authors at the festival today with their new novels and so on that particularly seem to be drawn to looking more at the local. I want to see if there's a shift there as well. There may or may not be. So firstly, I'm going to invite Uzma to speak for us a little bit in relation to this theme. I hope that her profile will be up on the screen there, but just briefly to say, for those of you who are not already aware, Uzma is the author of 4 novels, the most recent of which is entitled Thinner Than Skin, which sees its America-based protagonist return to Pakistan and travel to its northern borderlands, in my understanding, but she can correct me if I'm wrong. Uzma?
Should I start or should I correct you?
You can correct me first and then you can start.
That's only one thread of the book, but thank you for the introduction and Assalamu alaikum to all of you. It's a treat to be here since it's generally so hard for me to get away from the job that pays my rent. So it's actually my first KLF. And I'm delighted to see you all here and to see the growing interest in a conversation about literature, something that wasn't happening till just a few years ago when I was living in Lahore. And my love of books seemed to put me in a very small boat in a lonely sea. But that's changing and that's beautiful. So it's somewhat of a mixed blessing to begin my KLF experience with such a contentious topic, that of representation and audience, since I keep such a low profile. And since I'm a better writer than speaker, I've jotted down some of my thoughts. I decided I should start by speaking a little bit about the process of writing and to slice a few letters away from the word misrepresent and represent and look instead at the word present. Who is or isn't present when I write? My characters are my only audience when I write. They guide me, judge me, hear me, shun me. They and the words I use to find them, these are all I think and feel when I'm writing. So, for instance, if I write in my novel, The Geometry of God, about an 8-year-old girl who one day picks up a rock and discovers the world beneath the rock and is mesmerized by that world and wants to spend the rest of her life continuing to be mesmerized by that world, I'm not representing all 8-year-old Pakistani girls. I'm not saying all 8-year-old Pakistani girls have the same experience, even if I don't know why they wouldn't, since a rock is such a beautiful thing. I'm saying one girl does, and that's enough, and that's everything. Since completing my first book 13 years ago, I've often described them as my children. I may create them, but at some point they start creating me, and when each book is over and out in the world, I have to try not to think of it as an extension of me, just as parents should try not to think of their children as mere extensions of them. And we know how good they are at that. But what is astonishing is that sometimes other people see my children as an extension of themselves. And sometimes a few might recoil because they don't like what they see, making it impossible to convince them that I wasn't writing about them. I was writing about, an individual. I have to say that this hasn't happened very much because in general my readers have been generous and open. And in fact, I sometimes feel they've been more generous and open here in Pakistan and in India than in the West. But when there is a reaction that I just described, it almost always happens around the subject of sexuality, which I do write about, though it's hardly all I write about. There is an expectation that it's the book's responsibility, and by further extension, the author's responsibility, to match a certain fixed idea of what a Pakistani novel should be or should not be, and it should not be one in which a Pakistani woman writes frankly about sex. Neither from a woman's or a man's point of view, though when a man writes from a woman's point of view, he's seen as sensitive and empathetic. Occasionally there will be a reaction not to the book, but to where it is published. As an example, when my first book came out in 2001 at a reading in Lahore, a bookseller who hadn't read the book stood up and complained that it had been published in India. Apparently, I shamed her by being published in India. This was 13 years ago, and thankfully I don't hear this as much now. And now we have brave local publishers who are publishing both Pakistani non-fiction and fiction. Before, there was more interest in non-fiction. I think the interest in local fiction is growing. And therefore, there are more publishers who are willing to risk publishing them. And they're doing a fantastic job of it. But it should be said that, and I hope this will be contested during the Q&A, many Pakistani readers are more likely to read a novel in English if it has gotten extensive publicity abroad. And I hesitate to generalize because I don't think that's true for everybody, but I do think that, when a novel is extensively reviewed abroad and wins awards and makes it on bestseller lists, then interest grows locally. And if among this group there are then those who turn against the book because it didn't accurately represent their own very subjective idea of Pakistan, they end up turning against the very thing that they turned to for the wrong reason, namely that it got publicity abroad. But this talk of who is made to look like what and why and whose burden it is to prevent all this from happening reminds me a little too much of the many arguments I had growing up, arguments many girls in our society have with their families about the condition in which I left the house or with whom or how well I combed my hair or ironed my clothes or the number of times I visited so-and-so and so-and-so or somehow insulted someone by going to that house first. It's just something we're so preoccupied with in this society is who's saying what about whom. And it took a lot of discipline, courage, and cheekiness to refuse to carry the burden of appearance. So why would I let the thing that I love doing the most, writing, change that? Simply put, you cannot fall in love with your characters if you concern yourself with who sees them or how they're seen. And I can't write if I don't fall in love with my characters. I thought I'd end by taking the liberty of going slightly off topic and saying that, in truth, if some Pakistani readers hold that a Pakistani novel must accurately represent a fixed idea of us abroad. In my experience, many more British and American readers, including publishers, and this does tend to come more from Anglo-Saxon readers and publishers, hold that a Pakistani novel must accurately reflect a fixed idea of them. I've come up against a range of ways in which the West wants to see Pakistani books as an extension of their image of Pakistan, particularly when it comes to representations of women, from comments about women characters to certain covers I've had to fight to keep off my books. And I close with this to give an idea to you of how Pakistani writers in English are sometimes caught in the middle of these expectations and why it's best to reject the pressure from both sides equally. Because a writer's impulse is that of a child picking up a rock and being wonderstruck by what she finds hidden there. It is to explore the world, to move beyond doors that are closed, regardless of who closes them. Will there come a time when writers from Pakistan are read inside and outside Pakistan, not to see how they see us or how we see them, but for the beauty of the writing? It is only then that the Pakistani imagination will stop relying on and at the same time reacting to global literary trends and start to feed itself. And I am hopeful that that time is coming. So, thank you.
Thank you. And I think there are questions there that we can pick up on. Certainly the one that you raised about how many Pakistani readers will read a book in English if it's reviewed abroad, that will play into the questions that I've got for you afterwards. But thank you so much for that. We're going to move on, and I think we're going to hear from Bina next. Bina, again, is the author of 4 novels set in and around Karachi. Her most recent, A Season for Martyrs, dramatizes the return and attempted assassination. I think we move on at a later point to the assassination itself in the novel, but I've only read an excerpt so far. The assassination of Benazir Bhutto and its impact on everyday lives. It's to be published later in 2014, and I think Bina may read some of it to us. So, Bina.
Thank you, Madeline. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be here today with my co-panelists, who I admire greatly. And it's nice to be here with all of you. I see many familiar faces in the audience, old friends, new ones. So thank you all for coming out today to listen to a topic that is the reason we exist, live and breathe, writing, literature, and the communication of ideas to the audience. We as writers are interpreters of our own worlds, which we happen to inhabit with all of you. And although I haven't got prepared remarks for this, it's a question that isn't unfamiliar to me. It's a tricky question, how you as the writer feel about how you are perceived by your reader, by your audience. And when we write in English as Pakistanis, we're writing for multiple audiences. We're writing for a local audience, which reads English. We're writing for a local audience that may or may not read English with the same ease and fluidity. So they may be approaching the text in a different manner than a reader who has been schooled in English, raised to speak English primarily or bilingually. And then you have the third audience, which is your international audience, which may also include Pakistanis in the diaspora and then non-Pakistanis. So we're doing a balancing act of these 4 or 5 or then 20 different audiences. When I started writing last century, which is not very long ago, but I started writing in 1996, and it was a lot easier to write back then because there was no scrutiny. There was no scrutiny as there is today, what we experience today. So I can give you a sort of long-term perspective. I wrote my first book of short stories, which was nice, well-received, a sweet little book, experimental. Then I wrote my first novel called Where They Dream in Blue, which is a Bildungsroman, coming-of-age story about a Pakistani American who comes back to Pakistan to rediscover his heritage and his roots. And that book was curiously very, very popular amongst teenagers, university students, college students, young adults. I was young myself at the time when I wrote it. And what I found was that it struck a chord with the same age group that I was in when I had written the book. It really struck a chord with them, and there was a real feeling of camaraderie. Okay, she gets it. She knows. She understands what a certain subsection goes through when they maybe come back from university abroad. They get it. The book wasn't meant to be autobiographical, but every writer's first novel usually has elements of autobiography in it, so there was a lot of me in there. The second novel was The 786 Cyber Cafe, which is about a group of three young men who attempt to start a cyber cafe on Tariq Road, right at the time when the internet was coming to Pakistan. The internet came to Pakistan about 96, 97. The book I wrote was released in 2004. And it attempted to look at class. It attempted to look at class in Pakistan, the middle class that doesn't speak English, that is entrepreneurial and doesn't have the privileges and the access that the upper classes and the elite do. And that book was also well received at home. People thought it was funny. People thought that it captured a certain zeitgeist and a certain angst and a certain aspiration to more, to doing more, and to using technology to leapfrog out of limitations. And it had one of my favorite characters, which is Nadia, a girl who moves around in a burqa and comes to the cyber cafe secretly to learn how to use the internet because she feels that it will expand the world she lives in. And then the novel that came after that, Slum Child, things changed because not only had we changed, the world had changed. 9/11 had happened. Pakistan felt the effects of the war on terror and tremendous examination from the rest of the world. Who were we? What were we? How could we let certain things happen in this country? What were we up to? People were suddenly very suspicious about us. The second thing that happened was that book was translated into Italian and Spanish and published in Italy and Spain. And so it reached an international audience, whereas the first three books hadn't to that scale. And so the dynamic for me shifted vastly, because not only was I accessing a different audience, I was writing to a different time. And because the book Slum Child touches on a very difficult subject, which we know about today, but when I wrote about it back in 2006, it hadn't really been clearly spoken about in public discourse as it is today, but the treatment of minorities, and especially Christians, because the protagonist of Slum Child is a Christian girl growing up in a slum in Karachi. And I wrote that novel because I was very angry about the way that minorities were treated in our country. So I wrote this story. I didn't intend for it to be preachy or sort of trying to give any moral lessons of any sort, but I'm sure some of that came through, because when local audiences, when Pakistanis in Pakistan read this book, I had reactions that I had not encountered before. I had people becoming very upset and angry. And I remember going to a book club to meet some readers and being angrily confronted and told, how could you write this book? You're not telling the truth. This doesn't happen. We treat our minorities very, very well. So that was a real eye-opener for me. It was the first time that I had experienced such a strong reaction and a challenge to what I had written. And although we as writers like to talk about how we're telling the truth is that there isn't just one truth, there are many truths. And so the truth for that person at the book club who confronted me by saying, we treat our minorities very well, that may have been truth to her. And what was truth to me was that, no, we don't. And today, about 7-8 years later, we are having these discussions. We are having more evolved discussions about this. But that book was the turning point, and it really brought home to me your point about how we're received abroad is very different from how we're received at home. We're writing to a tougher audience. There's more scrutiny. you can't get away with as much with your own home audience, because they will catch you. They will turn around and say, no, this street isn't like this. That doesn't happen in such a way. And so it's tough. It's very much of a juggling act. Although, again, memory and recollect works differently for me than it may do for my reader. So you are going to be more challenged, I think. And I think as we come across with more Pakistani writing in English, that's just going to grow. That tension is going to grow.
And I think that's exciting too. Bina, we're a little bit in need of pushing on, so perhaps we could come back and hear some of... but there are some questions there. I think that's very interesting for me about the degree of scrutiny and how that feels. I'm interested also by this idea of there being certain moments when you might feel compelled to tackle certain subject matter. And that subject matter may be something that is dealing with your perception of things here, but also perhaps pressures from abroad and the need to respond to certain moments. So we'll come back to that, hopefully, in the question and answer. Sure. I'd like to turn now, we're going to go on and ask HM to give us his wisdom, or however he feels best to respond. HM, I think, for most of you, is best known for his novel Homeboy, which was set in New York after the 9/11 attacks, and tells the story of how its three protagonists try to navigate that changed landscape. I believe he's now working on his new novel, which is set in and around Karachi, and he's based here at this point in time. Would you like to give us some response to this question of international representation and perhaps the response of local readers to your work?
Ladies and gentlemen, I have been writing since I was a child. I summoned the requisite courage to embark on a novel circa 2003. It was a fraught time. Halfway through, I considered pitching the novel. Halfway through, I suffered the sort of anxiety that comes with this profession, an anxiety that's a function of a lack of infrastructure. You're on your own, and you don't know where you stand. I worked, and the anxiety of constructing a narrative, of creating characters, animate characters, three-dimensional characters that stay with the reader when the reader has put the book down. I write to allay my anxieties. It's a very personal imperative. Halfway through, I never thought I'd have an audience, much less complete my novel. And so, I never once thought about matters of representation. I had other concerns. I had more important concerns. And the first time I was aware that, was made aware of such matters was after the publication, when I think it might have been my first interview, when somebody asked me, how do you feel being a Pakistani writer? Do you consider yourself a Pakistani writer, or do you consider yourself an expatriate? Do you consider your book to be South Asian, part of the South Asian canon, or is it a New York novel? And I thought about it. It had taken me 4 or 5 years to complete this work, a work that I never thought would see the light of day. And I thought about this question, and it was a question that I found somewhat irrelevant to me. It's a question for librarians. Where does my book figure on a bookshelf? I write because I have to. I write because I have an itch. These, again, this is not something that I have ever thought about. And I wonder whether these questions are posed to British writers. Can you imagine Martin Amis or Ian McEwan contending with questions of representation? Does Martin Amis represent the British accurately? I think it becomes very silly. Does Don DeLillo accurately represent Americans? This tendency to anthropologize sort of Pakistani fiction is somewhat unnerving. I don't, but again, I've got other concerns. There's life and mortality and love and themes that I am trying to summon in some meaningful way in my next novel.
Thank you. I think you could. Would you like to tell us just a little bit more about the next novel?
My next novel is set in Karachi. I like to think of it as a big bad comic epic, but I think I'll fall short of that ambition. It's great fun. It keeps me up till 6 a.m. every night, and I hope that it depicts a certain reality, but there is it will not. I'll tell you now, accurately represent this complicated city, one of the largest cities in the world.
Thank you. We're going to move on now to our last speaker, and then I'll embark on some questions for the speakers. Shandana has been a columnist, a teacher, an actor, a screenwriter, a playwright. Anything else?
Novelist.
Novelist, of course. And her first novel, Tunnel Vision, was published in 2007 and was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. Well, I'd like to add that most of the writers here have been shortlisted or have won one prize or another. It's set in Karachi, and it's told from the perspective of a comatose woman with a strong will. Your second novel, I think, will be published by Hachette later this year and is for younger readers, Survival Tips for Lunatics. I couldn't find a great deal on the subject matter.
Of Survival Tips for Lunatics? It's precisely that.
Pardon?
That's a summary of the plot as well.
Okay.
And I wouldn't say it's a book for younger readers. I think it's a book for all ages. It's about being lost and being orphaned.
Great. Well, perhaps you can say a bit more. I'd like to hand over to you now to respond to the theme.
Actually, HM gave me a perfect jumping off point because when I read the topic, the Pakistani novel, I had precisely the same thought. What is the Pakistani novel? We don't ever hear about the great New Zealand novel or the great Scandinavian novel. So yes, that is something that we are lumped with. It comes from outside. And then I started thinking that yes, there is animosity. People are critical. You do get questions like the ones my co-panelists have mentioned. But what does that stem from? I don't think there's any malice in it. I think basically the problem is that people look at novelists these days in Pakistan, other Pakistanis, and assume that we're having a good time, that we're having more fun than you are. That's really not true. So I'm just going to pretend that there is let's say there's a hypothetical novelist in Pakistan and this is what their life is like. When you first decide to embrace the path of being a writer, your family will be disappointed in you because you don't have a proper job. Once you actually start writing, you will not be able to live off it. Third, when you do write and you get published, your spouse, your mother, your lover, your pet will assume that whatever you're writing is about them. Even worse, they might assume that it's not about them, that it's about someone else. Either way, it's trouble. Basically, although we might seem to be getting a lot of attention right now because we're sitting on stage, and I believe that we're also on a projector, in real life we have no social currency. We're considered losers. So please do not resent us for, having a moment. I have other stuff to say also, which I wrote down, and I'm going to now refer to. Okay, something else that you have to deal with as a writer here is you deal on a daily basis with the practical implications of the lack of a reading culture. We don't have nuance and understanding of this craft or of what it takes to live this life. So when my first novel was published, somebody came up to me and said, "Oh, I read your autobiography." And you think, okay. And then what else happens? Everybody thinks that they have a novel inside them too. Everybody does. And that's fine. But then you have people coming up to you and saying things like, "I have a great idea for a novel. I need you to write it for me." Okay. Then there is the anguished inner life. Gore Vidal said that every time a friend succeeds, a little part of me dies. This is also true of novelists. For example, I might seem to be very calm, but I know that Uzma Aslam Khan won a prize yesterday, so right now I'm consumed with resentment. And I'm smiling now. After this, I'm going to take her to the pool and try to drown her. Then there is the fact that even when you do speak in public, most people are not listening to you. So tomorrow, for example, I might open the paper and read a review of this panel, and there will be one line about me which will say, "Shandana Minhas said she was a loser." The finer points will be lost. But I also think that at the end of the day, like Hussein said, none of this matters. We do what we do, and that's the way it's going to continue. And this animosity that we're facing, and I think also this is being blown out of proportion. Everybody has opinions, that's fine. Who wants to live in a world where everybody thinks like you do? In Punjabi films, there is this classic shot of the horse, the man on the horse running past a boulder. It's always the same horse. They take one shot and they put it on a loop. So my final words would be, don't hate the ghora, hate the game.
Thank you. Bearing all of your comments in mind, I'm not sure how well my questions are going to go down, but I still think there's something to unpick here, and perhaps that's coming from an external or Western perspective, if that's where I come from, which I guess is certainly the starting point, around how Pakistani fiction novels depict, if not represent, Pakistan to their audiences, and the responsibility that it does or doesn't have to those audiences. So, can I just ask our panelists, first of all, this question of frustration around how novelists with a Pakistani affiliation depict aspects of Pakistan. Is that a frustration? Do you read yourselves and feel a frustration at the way in which a certain individual or aspect associated with Pakistan is represented in a novel? Is that something that you find as a frustration? Would anyone like to, Bina or Uzma?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Okay. This idea of readers being frustrated with what they feel is the way that Pakistan is represented by writers in English to audiences abroad. Is that a frustration with which you identify in your own reading if you read something by a Pakistani writer?
I mean, it depends which audience you're talking about and who's feeling the frustration. Do you mean that local Pakistanis feel frustrated with how they're represented by us?
I'm not necessarily saying by you, no. May I take a chance just to read something that provided a starting point for this discussion for me? which was, I've written quite a lot about the reluctant fundamentalist and other novels such as that. And after some discussion with Zara Sabri, she wrote a piece called Who's Pakistan, Whose Picture, which appeared in Dawn last year, particularly talking about Pakistani writers in English. And she wrote, a book like The Reluctant Fundamentalist comes your way and you find yourself inexplicably repelled by the rather gimmicky cover featuring a Pakistani-looking face split between the identity of a young, clean-shaven, corporate professional and a bearded and turbaned creature. There's no doubt that you're still very attracted to the topic, she says, and excited to read a book that promises to explore something you see around you at a time when a fair number of educated and modern youths seem to be heading down a particular path. There is a feeling of deflation, however, as you discover that the book is not an introspective exploration of your own, or rather our own, anxieties, ideological or other, but in fact an explanation directed toward Western readers of how Pakistanis, or Muslims in this case, come to feel uncomfortable in Western societies. So she's speaking to that feeling of uncomfortability about a fiction being directed to an audience abroad, and for her not feeling that that's representative of her own reality or the reality of others around her. Now obviously that's thinking about particular ideas of representation, what is authentic, that we want to get away from here. But I just wondered whether it's a frustration that any of the writers here identify with, or want to move beyond in well, of course you want to move beyond in your own writing, but...
Well, I think, if what I'm hearing is correct, I think we're talking about a phase of 10 years in which I think there was a lot of pressure on Pakistani writers to write the 9/11 novel.
Yeah.
Let's just come out and say it. There was a lot of pressure put on Pakistani writers to produce the novel that would define 9/11 for Western audiences. And I felt it was a trap because, yes, this was an earth-shattering, world-changing event. How could you not write about it? But at the same time, if you write about it, you don't want to limit yourself to just that. And so I think that was a very dangerous time for Pakistani novelists because we ran the risk of pigeonholing ourselves and becoming the terror interpreters and giving voice to that and that alone, and that would be seen as sexy by Western publishers, and they would pour lots of money into it, and this would be really cool. But I think that any Pakistani writer with an ounce of sense would know better than to fall into that trap. And if to deal with 9/11, then to deal with it in a nuanced way, so that you were not serving 9/11, you were not slave to that narrative, you were not becoming the mouthpiece for it, but you were writing about it only if it served your story. So I do feel optimistic that phase has now passed. I think the fascination with 9/11 and terror has dampened. And we, as writers, I don't mean to be representative, but I think we're always writing what we have wanted to write regardless of that pressure. And we have all written stories that talk about things that have nothing to do with that. And we want those stories to be heard.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, I think there's a difference between writing fiction and being a reporter. So writers don't sit down and flip through an index of topics and say, I'm going to write about that now. That's not how it works. So that's the first response. Second, this pressure is something that comes from the market. It's external, not internal, and we really don't need to be thinking about it, or we're not necessarily preoccupied by it. And I'm actually kind of astonished by the position we're supposed to be inhabiting or defending right now.
World War II, World War I, World War II produced a great canon of writing. people still write about World War II almost a century afterwards. The Holocaust has stirred writers to write, Elie Wiesel, and there are writers who are engaged with the world around them, and that's something that has always happened. There are writers that are divorced from the world. Vladimir Nabokov, for instance, escaped Tsarist Russia and wrote a love story featuring a dirty old man and a prepubescent girl. Politics was not something that his traumatic escape, he never returned to his homeland again, never figures in his novels. Whereas Naipaul, on the other hand, is always political. In that way, there is no responsibility in that way. There's no responsibility to, does one fault Nabokov for never writing about this traumatic political seismic event where the old Russia changed and the communists took over? Nabokov never wrote about it. But the question on this panel, and I think this panel is somewhat misconceived, is that there is a certain responsibility that we have to engage. And there are writers, and there are writers amongst this contemporary Pakistani amongst us that are engaged, and there are those who are not particularly engaged. But there should be no responsibility. And these questions of representation, again, you don't read the book for you don't read a novel for anthropological value. You read it for, there are other ways to read the book, and those are the ways that are more interesting to me. My book is fundamentally, my debut novel, my one and only novel, is fundamentally a coming-of-age story. And it's a comedy. It's perhaps the only comedy that contends with 9/11. But there are plenty of Pakistani authors who have other concerns. There's Azhar Abadi, there's Imad Rahman, writers that are writing about many other things, writers that have not attended the KLF. So I just find this, I find it unnerving to be thinking of some sort of responsibility. A novelist writes because he has to, a novel writes because he or she wants to tell stories. So, yeah.
I just wanted to add a few things. This question of engagement, and I mean, every time you write, you are engaging. As soon as you inhabit the character, you're engaging. As soon as you're living in another world, living in their skin, understanding their history, figuring out a word, you're engaging. So there is no such thing as a writer who doesn't engage. The frustration that I think Madeline talked about earlier, I'm also going to say that I'm not comfortable with thinking that way, because my concern when I'm writing, as I said earlier, who's present when I'm writing? The only one who's present when I'm writing is the character. They are my audience. And I'm not interested in imagining an audience who's going to judge me for the way my characters are speaking to me.
And I think that's something that very much comes through in your fiction. In fact, there was something that you said in October 2010, I think you said, which to me emphasizes that the personal dimension, being driven by that first and foremost, and being true to your characters rather than true to a wider expectation or answering to that or someone else's reality. You said something about the need to look in Pakistan's looking glass and know the slippery ghosts of my history, which has been important. And that sense of of exploring something from a more personal perspective rather than think about the pressures from outside in order to understand it for yourself and then perhaps to present a version of your understanding to others that then they can interpret rather than writing to a particular format. Right. Did you want to say any more about that? Or?
Not really. I mean, I think it's worth reiterating that the pressure does come from outside. So, for instance, when I finished The Geometry of God, one publisher saw it, and his response was, this was right after the Chief Justice had been sacked. I was living in Lahore. And, he said, well, you're living in Lahore, there are all these protests, how come there's no sacked Chief Justices in your book? And, I mean, would you say that to a manuscript submitted by a British or an American? This has already been said, but I think it's worth repeating, is that the pressure comes from outside for Pakistani writers to somehow speak to what's happening in the news, whereas as a writer, I'm more interested in what's not being said in the news, because that's where the stories are. It's in the hidden corners, it's in the darkness, it's where the light isn't shining.
Oh, there's a sacked Chief Justice in mine. You can ask him to read mine.
A couple of years ago, the chairman of the Nobel Prize Committee made this statement that became very controversial. He said that when Philip Roth was one of the dark horse candidates for the Nobel Prize from the States, he said, I don't think the Americans deserve a Nobel Prize. And it's because American fiction is very insular. So Philip Roth, sentence for sentence, is a fabulous writer. But the chairman of the Nobel Prize Committee was suggesting that Newark, New Jersey, doesn't have global resonance. So I've never come across a panel, though, that deals with the insularity of American fiction. I love American fiction, but it is weirdly, it hasn't contended with America's foreign policy failures in the last decade. It hasn't dealt with the mess in Afghanistan. It hasn't dealt with the mess in Iraq. It hasn't really dealt with mess in Honduras. I mean, so American fiction is to use as an example, as another paradigm. It's a very different it's a very different way of writing and a very different body of work. And what is interesting about Pakistani fiction, what I find particularly exciting about Pakistani fiction, is that no two novels are alike. I think all of us write very differently. There is no common aesthetic, and it's exciting. Whereas one thinks about the Indian novel, and one thinks about the contemporary French novel. That sort of excitement, I think, is not associated with other sorts of novels. Pakistani writing is interesting because there's some people who are sort of political, some who aren't. Mohsin Hamid, for instance, his first novel was about the sort of bourgeois Lahore, and it was not particularly political. So I don't think the Pakistani novel, you cannot yet try to define the Pakistani novel, and that's what's exciting about it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we need to open up to some questions now. So is there a mic that's going around? Lovely. So do we have any questions in relation to this? Yeah, the gentleman here.
This question is for Ms. Bina Shah. You write a column for the New York Times, and that is to a very particular sort of audience when you do that. So I was wondering, did you ever feel you need to take up an ambassadorial position did the editors there tell you to write about specific things? Because I'm guessing they would be interested in knowing the Pakistani life, in quotations, and those sort of pressures in writing that column in particular.
Thank you. That's a great question, and it's excellent. When they gave me the column, they said the only thing we don't want you to write about is drones. Please don't write about politics. We have enough of that. We want to know about Pakistan. And they didn't even use the cliche of the soft side of Pakistan, and I give them a lot of credit for that. And I'm writing for the International New York Times, which is the former Herald Tribune, so I'm writing to a very global audience. I'm not writing to the U.S. audience, per se. They wanted to know about religion, culture, society, life, anything, and they just said anything you want to write about. That's gold for a writer, to just be given a blank page and just say, do what you want. And to date, they have not. They asked me for initial pitches, 4 or 5 to start with, but if I want to write about whatever, I can send it in, and they will look at it and run it. So there's no sort of at all dictation that I have to take from them about what to write about. It's entirely up to me.
Great, thank you.
But ambassadorial, I'm sorry, I realized I didn't answer the question properly. I feel responsibility. I'm no diplomat, okay? So I'm not tactful. I'm not going to be careful, and I don't write Foreign Office dispatches to make you feel good about this country. I try to write an honest perspective, what I know from having lived here for 25 years. Ambassador is a very loaded term, but I like the term cultural diplomacy, because I think that what I can do with this column is to build some bridges and make Pakistan relatable, so that people who have never been here and never intend to come here can understand what it might be like to live here from a certain perspective.
Thanks. Yes, we have a lady over here with the dark glasses. Just here.
I'm sorry if this is going to sound repetitive, but I think Pakistani writers tend to write for the Western gaze. And as you said, that you're trying to make Pakistan relatable. And then when I read Pakistani novels, I can never relate to the characters, the protagonist, as myself. Again, I am back to being a child reading an English book about an English character when none of them look like me or have had the same life experiences. So can you comment on that?
क्या पढ़ती हैं आप? आपने कौन सी किताबें पढ़ी हैं? इतनी ज़्यादा किताबें हैं, तो आप में उसमें अपना किरदार कहीं नहीं मिलता. तो आप और पढ़ें.
Bookshops are filled with how to do books, how to do books type. What is this? The failure of imagination, or the fear to face the facts? Your view?
I'm sorry, is someone speaking?
There in the corner. It's a gentleman in the back over there.
Can you wait 1 second? Because I think HM was just still trying to respond to that question.
देखें जी, आप सारा सुलेरी पढ़िए, मीटलेस डेज, जुल्फ़िकार गोल साहब की आप मर्डर ऑफ अजीज़ खान पढ़ें, इनक्रेडिबल ब्राज़िलियन पढ़ें, वापसी से दुआ पढ़ें, इमाद रहमान, अजहर आबदी. इस साल शज़फ हैदर की किताब निकली है, बिलाल तनवीर साहब ने किताब, उनकी डेब्यू हुई है. उमर शाहिद हैज़ रिटन a criminal thriller. Saad Shafqat has written a medical thriller. If none of these books have something that you can relate to, then perhaps the problem lies with you.
I'd like to add something to that.
Okay.
There's a way to look at this in a positive way, which is that the desire we hear expressed so often from readers in Pakistan that we are somehow misrepresenting them or they can't find themselves in our books speaks of a deep and abiding love for literature. So as a writer, I'm personally inspired by that. It might be annoying at the moment, but that's the bigger picture. Let's remember that.
And I think we had some discussion yesterday with Kudus Mercer around art, actually, and there was just a little comment that he made, which I think is quite useful here, which is that times do change, and what you look for 10 years past is different from what you look for when you're looking at an artwork or a novel in 10 years to come, and let's hope that this is a positive thing for Pakistani novels. I think we have maybe time for one more question. Lady in the front row. Yeah.
Hello. Oh.
What about the gentleman in the back?
I'm sorry. Yeah, I think the gentleman in the back was first. Can we keep our questions short so that we've got time to fit both in?
Bookshops are filled with how to do books, how to do books,
How to write.
how to do the job, you know. Bookshops are filled with these type of books. What is this? The fear of facing the facts, or fear of failure of imagination.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure I understood the question.
Non-fiction books are filled with, bookshops are filled with non-fiction. That is the how to do books. And fiction is rare in today's market, in the global market. So what is this? The fear of facing the facts, or fear of failure of imagination?
Okay, I think we're saying that there's a relative, that there's more non-fiction in the world than fiction, is that right? And maybe is that because of a fear of books, of reading, or of...
Fear of facing facts.
Fear of facing facts. Does anyone want to respond to that?
No.
No? Okay. I think we'll move on to the next question then.
Hello. There's this great TED talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie called The Danger of the Single Story. And she talks about how being a Nigerian writer, when she first went to America, people would say, "Oh my God, it's amazing you speak English." And she said to her American roommate, "I just saw American Psycho, and are you going to come and kill me with a knife?" And this idea of the perceptions that we have of each other. And I'm wondering, for you all, do you think that people would get over it eventually, or in 10 years or however many, we won't be needing to have this panel anymore at all?
Thanks. I think that's a great question for us to end with as well. Can we have a comment from one of you, or all of you would be nice, but...
Yeah, I'm hoping we're already over it. That's my hope. But as long as we have these artificially created boundaries and borders and artificially created differences, because I think there's a whole industry out there based on our differences. As long as that is perpetuated, then we'll have these kinds of questions, panels, so on, so forth. And Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is very frustrated with this. If you've read Americana, which I really recommend, it's amazing. She talks entirely about what is the perception of blackness, African blacks, non-African blacks. So again, I think there's just, as Uzma said, that we will always engage with these questions. Just hopefully they won't be as awkward to answer in the future.
Indian fiction, when Rushdie came out with Midnight's Children, and Seth came out with Suitable Boy, and Zulfikar Amitav Ghosh was writing, there were these questions amongst Indians, whether these are Indian writers. There were these anxieties that they're writing in English. And you don't have those questions anymore. Those anxieties have long been allayed. And as far as, it's been allayed for many reasons, because Indians have sort of managed to, उनने अंग्रेजी को अपना लिया है. और हमने अभी तक नहीं अपनाया, मगर अंग्रेजी की तारीख इस इलाके में बहुत पुरानी है और उर्दू नसर से ज़्यादा पुरानी एक तरह से है. दीन मोहम्मद was writing in the late 1700s. Urdu prose was canonized in and around Ghalib's letters. So इंग्लिश की रिवायत जो है, अंग्रेजी की रिवायत यहाँ बहुत पुरानी है. एंड सो दिस एंग्जाइटी कि ये हमारी है या नहीं है, भाई ये इसकी तारीख जो है वो बहुत पुरानी है और हमें अब अपना लेनी चाहिए. It is our language. So, you know, these are sort of natural anxieties, but I think they're kind of, it's silly. It's to me, it's silly. I think a good novel, a good story. Chekhov wrote at turn of the century Russia.
I think can you wrap up? Because
Chekhov, Chekhov wrote at turn of the century Russia about middle-class Russian anxieties, but for some reason, Chekhov has universal resonance. So a good story fundamentally is a good story.
Thank you, and I'm
Thank
sorry
you.
to cut you off, but that seems a much more positive note to end on. And I would say, certainly from where I'm based in the UK, in London, there is a huge desire for those stories that are not the stereotypical ones.
Can I just add very briefly, just 1 minute?
We do need to.
I appreciate that question, and I think, you know, in addition to accepting that English is our language, and in writing in English, we are making it a Pakistani language. In addition to that, it's also that there are more writers writing in English now than 10 years ago, 15 years ago. That's going to help. And there are more publishers willing to publish local writers, and that's going to help. So all of this will help make a panel such as this completely obsolete.
Redundant.
Hopefully very soon.
Thank you. And thank you so much to our speakers. I'm very grateful to them for joining me, and congratulations to Uzma as well.
Can I just make a housekeeping announcement? I'm sorry I have to do this, but Omar Shahid's launch of The Prisoner, which was scheduled for 5 o'clock, is actually taking place at 4 o'clock. So it's been moved up by 1 hour. If any of you were intending to come and hear him, he's going to be in the 007 room in about 15 minutes. I'm going to be speaking with him, so hope to see you there.
Thanks.